Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the四海为学collaborative learning project is based. I want to welcome you to our 12th book discussion and our 52nd event. We're here today to discuss Professor Jin Li's The Self in the West and East Asia, Being or Becoming. Today, we have a very nice lineup of scholars. We have Professor Tim Connolly, Professor Katherine No, and Dr. Li Luyao. And these are all great people, so I'm sure this is going to be a really fantastic event. Our chair today is Yidi Wu from Boston University. It has become a tradition here at四海为学to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to serve as chairs or discussants. So if there's any younger scholars in the audience today who wish to be part of future events, please email me. This event today will be 2 hours total and end promptly at 10 p.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Yidi, I want to say a few things about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be a counterbalance for the negative attitudes sometimes found in blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community forming settings. The neologism 四海为学 was created actually by Robin Wong, and it's a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家 at the forefront of all of our events. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in academic orientation during our events and these exchanges by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. Before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank you very much, Professor Jin Li, Professor Tim Connolly, Professor Katherine No, and Dr. Li Luyao for taking your time to be with us today. Our chair is Yidi Wu. He is a doctoral candidate from the Department of Religion at Boston University. He has a bachelor's degree in classics from Renmin University in China, and an MA in classics from the University of Arizona, and another MA in political science from Boston College. His interests include philosophy of religion, political theology, and comparative religious thought, namely East and West. We're very happy to have you here, Yidi. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, for your generous remark. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depends where you are. Welcome to this event. So I think I will introduce Professor Li Jing first, and then let her talk about her book for probably around like 20 minutes, and then I will give brief introduction to all of our commentators or discussants before they will give their remarks. So let's start. So it's a great honor to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Li Jing. Dr. Li Jing is a professor of education and human development at Brown University. She received her bachelor degree in German from Guangzhou Institute of Foreign Languages in China. She earned her first master degree in education from the University of Pittsburgh and the second master in administrative planning and social policy. And Her also received her Doctor of Education in Human Development and Psychology from Harvard. Dr. Li's research focuses on East Asian virtue-oriented and Western mind-oriented learning models, and how these models shape children's learning beliefs, parental socialization, and achievement. Her 2012 book, Cultural Foundations of Learning, East and West, synthesized related research over the past decades and offers new perspectives on the indispensable role of culture in human learning. Dr. Li was an inaugural fellow of Berggruen Institute from 2015 to 17, first at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Science, Stanford University, and later at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University in China. The Berggruen Fellowship actually supported her book projected entitled The Self in the West and East Asia, Being or Becoming, published in 2024. So this is the book we're going to talk today, and I'm excited about that. And in this book, Dr. Li synthesized philosophy with psychological research to examine how the self is conceptualized and functions in these two culture systems. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Li Jin to present her book.
All right. So bear with me. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, Yidi, for the nice introduction. I'm very honored to be featured on this forum. So I'll just get to the presentation, give a little bit introduction to this book. Okay, let me see if I can succeed. All right. Can you all see? Yeah, you can. Okay, great. All right, let me turn this on. Okay, yeah, all right. I hope you all can see this. So, this is the book title. To be or not to be, that is a strange question. So, the first time I heard this famous Shakespearean phrase, to be or not to be, that is the question, was when I was in college studying German in China. I failed to comprehend what I heard. I mumbled to myself, what kind of question is that? How come there is no subject who is to be or not to be or not to be, with whom, where, doing what? Then I learned that humans are called human beings, and that everything is also a being. And this felt like trying to get through a brick wall, as Chinese does not have the term being. We didn't have it for 1,000 years. Now we have it, but it's a translation of foreign languages, Western languages. So the human self is vast and complex. We might think our sense of self is the amalgam of our own feelings, thoughts, and experiences. However, what we define as our individual's own self owes much to the philosophy of our culture, as evinced by contemporary psychological research. Our culture's philosophy shapes who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. And this is the process of upbringing, socialization, education, and broadly construed. So both fields are very large, but remain quite disconnected. Both explore the human self deeply, albeit with different intellectual and methodological approaches. Philosophy quests for the nature of self, while psychology seeks, via empirical verification, self's concept, function, and effect on lived human experiences. The Berggruen Institute invited me to explore the self in a 2x2 design, that is, 2 disciplines and 2 cultural systems, to synthesize the insights into the self. And I thought this task was complex, too complex to take on. But after much endeavor, the book is done. And this is a report on my exploration. So, self is being or becoming. How many people think that the West is about becoming? That is, for example, discovering and realizing your potential. And that East Asia is about being, because people tend to be more fixed in their history and tradition. Well, my studies review a different counterintuitive picture. The West is more being oriented, and East Asia is more becoming oriented. To parallel, the Western ontological emblem, to be or not to be, that is question, the East Asian equivalent might be phrased as to become or not to become a full human. That is the question. So I would like to give two examples of Western greater being orientation and East Asian greater becoming orientation. The first one is the Western essential self, and it's the Asian particular self. The second one is Western linear self, and it's the Asian interrelational self. So let's take a look at the Western essential self. This is Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, Descartes, John Locke, and I'm going to put Heidegger there. Some from Greek to present philosophy. There's a very strong common theme that's called dualism. Okay, dualism basically says the human knowledge and understanding of the world has two levels. First one is what meets the eye, our senses. Like some people find some flowers beautiful, architecture beautiful, and colors beautiful. Others find other things beautiful. But no matter how varied it is across, from people to people, there's a common and very essential thing that is beauty. All of them belong to the idea of beauty. And of course, this dualism is related to mind-body distinction as well. So what is essence? Well, essence is the idea, a form, and it is thus regarded the ideal knowledge in the West. And each person has their own essential core self. And the purpose of life is to seek truth and to understand essence of the divine. For a long time, still today, many people do that. And the physical world, which is the science, natural science, and the human world, humanities, political science, social science, all of that. And of course, psychology aims also at understanding one's own self. So does this kind of conceptualization in the West find support among contemporary people as studied by psychology? The answer is yes. There are two, I want to give two examples. There is a huge body of research on personality traits across the world to reduce human personalities to a few types. Think about how many people live now on this planet. Yet the research is able to reduce that to a few types. The effort is quite sort of essentializing the world. Okay, so this is regarded as the human inner architecture. And here we go. This is called big 5 or 6. Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, and more recently, honesty, humility. The second line of research is true self. Now, researchers, in order to understand true self, researchers have studied all kinds of untrue and false self. And false self is clearly linked to psychological malfunctioning in the West. Okay, so there's a new research, mostly done at Yale University, and basically find the human self remains with their moral core. If a person's moral core is not changed, that person is the same person. Other superficial things can change. Okay, now switch to East Asia, a particular self. Now, here we go. Confucius mentions Xunzi, Chen Hao, Chen Yi, Zhu Xi, and Wang Yangming. Of course, there are people before Confucius, among them, many after them, just like the West, okay? But it's like this idea of particular self is mostly associated with Confucian philosophy since ancient times. Number one, there's no dualism, as I just talked about, but particularity in life. And just to get to this idea, I want to give some examples. There are dozens of self-referential terms in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. I know that, okay? Even though I don't speak Japanese and Korean, but I know that that's a fact because the scholars told me that. All tuned to particular social hierarchy, status, relational role, ritual practice, and context, and so on. So I'll give you an example. This is one of the terms. It's called later generation. It's referring to yourself, okay? So if I, as a student, were to greet a professor, I would not say Jin Li greets you or I greet you. I would say later generation greets Professor Wang. That's how people used to talk, and still many people use this today. Now, you might think this is the thing of the past. No, right now, if you look at the internet, a lot of people post news, videos, and so on. They, instead of referring to their names and their role like teacher, doctor, they say 小编, editor. The point is to lower yourself, but honor the audience. Okay. So the question is, do all of these philosophers think they're universals? Of course they do. For example, all of them think that everybody has a family, or else how could we come to the world, right? But I have my particular family with particular relationships. And my life goal is to cultivate myself in particular relationships, socially, virtuously, morally, and to become the most genuine, sincere, humane person, now translated as exemplary person, 人, thus the concept of becoming. All right. Does this kind of conceptualization find psychological evidence among contemporary people? Yes. Again, I'm going to give you two examples. There's a large body of research on so-called self-descriptions. So psychologists went around to ask people to tell me about yourself, write down about yourself, and fill out, this sentences that begins with I and 20 times, and look at the data. And what they found is that the Asians show far fewer essentialist but more contextual attributes when they describe themselves. The green one, I'm friendly, is frequently found among Western heritage people, but I'm friendly to peers at school. It's frequently found among Asians. And second line of research is called self-consistency. And that is basically the person behaves, thinks, feels, across relationships and situations, if not always over time, but sometimes over time as well. So in other words, you try to be consistent no matter who you're dealing with. Well, self-consistency is, very important and linked to well-being among Westerners. But East Asians show more inconsistency. However, this is unrelated to their well-being. So they are more consistent within particular relationships and domains. For example, mother-child relationship is more consistent. And in the moral domain, at least, it makes no sense for me to be upright yesterday and today I'm a little crooked. So the consistency is actually important. All right, so let's switch to the second facet of self. So in the book, I talk about 7. And second one is linear self. Philosophy. I'm going to give a different set of philosophers. This is Pythagoras. This is Francis Bacon, Galileo, Newton, and Immanuel Kant, Einstein, and Piaget, because I study Piaget. Okay, so all of them, I think, should belong to the group. Of course, there are people before, among, many after them. Okay, so again, from ancient to present philosophy, there's a strong theme on rational logical thinking. It's highly pressed. Linear, when I say linear, I mean clear, transparent, procedural, decisive, concise, and to the point self. I mean, children are brought up to think this way. They strive in life by entertaining questions like, is the self clear or opaque to oneself or to the outside world? And does the self function clearly, objectively, precisely versus opaquely, indeterminately, or vaguely? Now, getting the essence of things is the goal, but the process is what's linear about it. Opacity, ambiguity poses some challenges to Western heritage people. So there's a strong effort to model the world mathematically, physical, human. The point is to tease the relevant from the irrelevant. Logic rigor applied to many domains of life. Deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, very strong. And reason for faith to contemplate the divine, very strong throughout Western history. St. Augustine, obviously, Thomas Aquinas, and other theologians wrote about this extensively. Rule of law, as we practice contemporarily and throughout history, political, business, professional deliberations all rely on rationality. Even art uses that, okay? So, for example, perspective, proportionality, precision in graphic design, pigments, and music score use numbers. And daily life also requires linear thinking. So Does this find evidence in psychology? Yes. There's a large body of research, mostly done by Richard Nisbet's team at University of Michigan. And what they found in many experiments found is that Westerners have a greater reliance on rules, categories, structures to organize the world, their worlds, and they spontaneously categorize things for reasoning, find it easier to learn and use rule-based categories. And I know this because I'm in the field of education, on research on education. The curriculum of school subjects is built on a linear progression, stressing analytical thinking. And for example, language instruction begins often with phonics by breaking down the smallest sound units with increasing complexity. When children get older, they learn how to write essays by making a thesis and develop argument, provide support, and draw a conclusion into a logical whole. The point is to persuade your reader. In East Asian, now switch to interrelational self. Now I'm going to put up a different set of philosophers. Oh, sorry. So I want to clarify these terms. So relationality and interrelationality. Relationality is a very well studied concept in a number of fields regarding East Asian thinking. But I prefer to use interrelationality because it points to greater complexity that has yet to be explored. Now, no reasonable person would ever argue that somehow Western people are not social. I've heard those arguments, okay? Somehow don't value social relationships because that's downright false. All cultures need and value social relationships. How interrelationality is philosophized, works, and lived may differ from culture to culture, and the differences are worth understanding because consequences are serious, okay? So here is a different set of philosophers. This is Fu Xi. He was supposed to have lived some 8,000, 10,000 years ago, and he was supposed to have drawn the first book of changes, trigrams. This is a kingman of Zhou. Many thousand years later, reoriented his drawing and laid the foundation for the current book of changes, Zhou Yi. Okay, and this is good old Lao Tzu. Many people are familiar, and Zhuangzi, Tao Yuanming, and Li Bai. Probably not many before Fu Xi, but after him, many, and among them, and many after. Okay, so it's a very large group of philosophers. All of them, of course, they have their differences, but all of them are sharing one thing in common that's called holism in philosophy. Both Taoism and Confucianism are deeply anchored in interrelationality. Holism, things are related, okay? Taoism is more on human to human, human to cosmos interrelationality. Me faces the cosmos, me faces nature, and so on. And Confucianism is more on human to human interrelationality, family, friendship, relationships among people. People draw on both to guide their lives. To illustrate Taoist philosophy, I like to talk a little bit about Robin Wang's excellent discussion of yin-yang philosophy, okay? So her name came up because the name 四海为学 is related to that. Okay, here's what Robin talks about. Now, normally when people think about the, Taoist philosophy, think of yin-yang. Yeah, it's not wrong, okay? But because it points to contradiction, opposition, 矛盾. But there are a bunch of others. The second one is interdependence, 相依. That means one side party cannot exist without the other, or cannot be conceptualized. For example, the idea of large cannot be possibly talked about without simultaneously evoking the idea of small. So the next one is 互含, mutual inclusion. Even the highly prominent visible contains the insignificant hidden, and that is the black dot, white dot in the opposite fish in the yin symbol. That's a very well represented. Okay. And next was 交感, interaction, resonance as a sound echo relation. Complementarity and mutual support. The next one, 互补. One party supplies what the other lacks. So this is commonly used in East Asian education in the classroom. Two students who are not, one is good at math, the other one is reading, they help each other, and they both end up improving in both disciplines and so on, okay? And next one is change and transformation, 转化, timeless change from one state to another, and the seasonal change. I would name like Western elections is like that, okay? Just the cycle, okay? Yeah. So East Asians tend to be at greater ease with ambiguity and contradiction in a daily life. There's a high alertness to avoidance of extremity in any situation. Due to Taoist influence, there are many idioms used in daily life. I'm going to give you just examples, like here in 忍气吞声 and so on. You can quickly scan 塞翁失马焉知非福 and so on. So many, many, hundreds of these every day we use to help us get through the day. Okay. So an East Asian art tradition is also full of interrelationality. All right. So the research supports, oh, yes, very much. Okay. So I want to give one example of research done by Cohen and Guntz. They studied the so-called egocentric versus relational emotional projections onto others. So basically what they did is ask people to recall a strong emotional experience and then retell their experience. Here is what they found. They found the Euro-Canadians used way more first-person perspective to tell their emotional experience. Asians use a lot more third person. And Canadians further use more, Canadians use furthermore projected their own emotions onto others. That means when I feel angry, and I know the other person also may feel angry because I can affect that person. And looking from their own perspective. However, Asians projected others' emotions appropriate to their viewing perspectives. That is, when I feel ashamed, other people may hold me in contempt. So in other words, this perspective switch. All right. So I'm coming to the end. The remaining parts of the book, I have briefly shared the parts of 2 chapters of 9. Those interested, welcome to this book. And of course, your opinions I value very much. Thank you very much. And that's the end. I will stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Li, for this wonderful book. And I think I will just proceed to the discussion section or part of this event. So I will go through the order that listed on the website. So our first speaker or discussant or commentator will be my friend Tim. So I will briefly introduce you, Tim, before you give your remarks. So Dr. Timothy Connolly is professor of philosophy at East Stroudsburg University. His research focuses on ethics in classic Chinese tradition, as well as the methodology of cross-cultural philosophy. He's the author of Doing Philosophy Comparatively, the book, I think the first edition published in 2015, and there's like a second edition published in 2023, which is a wonderful book. And the Foundations of Confucian Ethics, Virtues, Roles, and Selves, which is a forthcoming book, and I look forward to your book project, Tim. So the floor is yours, Tim.
All right, thank you, Yidi, for that introduction, and also thanks to Paul for inviting me to participate in the session. Everyone can hear me all right, I think. Okay, great. Great. So first, I wanted to express how much I admired this book and how much I learned from it. As Professor Li notes in the introduction to the book, even though the main differences between the East Asian and Western selves have been explored in many studies, both in philosophy and psychology, there are still significant dimensions of these 2 versions of the self that are not fully understood. And she contends that this is especially true with the East Asian conception of self. And as she notes later in the book, there's much more to the self than Western concept of self A versus some other culture's concept, not A, Western concept of the self B versus some other culture's concept of the self not B, right? But there are other features that are maybe not robustly conceptualized in the Western model of self that might be important in the East Asian model, and we should try to study those additional features as well. As I was reading through the introduction to the book, the first book that jumped out as a point of comparison was Nisbet's famous Geography of Thought book. And that's a book that I often recommend to students in my cross-cultural philosophy classes if they want to get a sort of big picture perspective on the Western and East Asian conceptions of self. But I found Professor Li's book went into much more depth on many aspects of this comparison. First, the philosophical foundations. Nisbet doesn't have a whole lot about that, but this book has something in every chapter about that. I found it had more updated references. You know, Nisbet's book, I think, is about 20 years old now. And Nisbet's book also only really has one chapter on the self, whereas this book has 7 central chapters. 5 of them discuss core aspects of the nature of self, and 2 of them discuss how these aspects are expressed in daily living. So in my teaching and research on cross-cultural philosophy, I think Professor Li, this book will now be the first book that I turn to look at ideas about the East Asian and Western self. And I also appreciated the work throughout the different chapters to show how these features of the self are different from one another, how they don't necessarily imply one another, but they're analytically distinct. So for instance, the essential aspect of the Western self is distinct from the bounded aspect of the Western self. And we could have one aspect without having the other. Professor Li also shows how the particular dimension of the East Asian self is not the same as the flexible dimension of the East Asian self, and so on with all the other dimensions that are explored in the book. Other works I've read on this topic, like they usually focus on just 1 or 2 of the different dimensions. And I found often the different dimensions are treated as they are a kind of package deal, right? Where if you have one feature of the self, like that implies you have all the features of the self. So I appreciated the idea that maybe it's not a package deal, right? But the different combination of features is contingent, right, rather than necessary. The main area I wanted to focus my discussion on is a theme that comes up in a number of different places in the book, and one that I've been interested in my recent work. And that is how these different self-conceptions influence decision-making. So in chapter 3 of the book, Professor Li shows how the notion of self that emerged in the West during the Renaissance elevated the individual capacity to make choices and to take charge of one's destiny. She traces this idea all the way to the rise of existentialism, where thinkers in the West in the 19th and 20th century emphasize our responsibility for our own decisions, the importance of pursuing our own individual uniqueness. In looking at the empirical support for this view, the book points to studies suggesting that Westerners rely on primary control in accomplishing their life goals. They want to use their own efforts to change reality, whereas people of East Asian heritage rely on secondary control, adjusting themselves to fit with the existing reality. Decision-making also comes up in the chapter on the Western linear self versus the East Asian interrelational self that was discussed in the introduction just now. And she also discussed, the book notes that when making important decisions, people of East Asian heritage tend to weigh multiple perspectives against one another to keep different possible options open, to take a broad view that sees good fortune and bad fortune as following on one another, as in the famous Taoist parable about the man who loses his horse. Westerners, on the other hand, because of their penchant for linear thinking, seek a clear and straightforward path to realizing their personal goals. They aren't as comfortable with ambiguity, vagueness, or contradiction. Another important difference that influences decision-making comes up in later chapters. In chapter 7, the book describes how Western heritage people want to be left alone to make their own decisions. Too much interference from other people can be seen as their attempts to control us when we are making our decisions. And this holds true even and especially in cases where the people are close to us, especially our parents or our spouses. We're not comfortable with them interfering in our decisions. And here's a quote from chapter 8 of the book, where Professor Li says, Western heritage people may try to avoid the impression that one is dependent on others to get through life because dependence is not valued. We frequently hear Westerners say, it is my life. I have to take the initiative and give it my best shot. And immediately I was reminded of this famous song that one still hears on the radio all the time in America, where the chorus just says, it's my life, it's now or never. I think if you have been anywhere where they are playing radio, you have heard this famous song by Bon Jovi, where the chorus is just yelled out, it's my life, it's now or never. I'm not going to live forever. So like this is part of the air we breathe, I think, in places like America, this idea that I need to take charge of my life. And then the book also mentioned studies that show how external influence can encroach on Western people's well-being. We're always encouraged to be ourselves. And without doing that in our life, we can't develop a healthy sense of identity and who we are. So here's my question. If we recognize that there's a feature of our cultural heritage that's deeply entrenched, but we also recognize that in some ways that feature is not always so good for us, how capable are we of changing that feature? So in the case of decision-making in particular, if someone who grows up in a place like America recognizes that it's very limited to be so totally reliant on yourself in making big decisions, the value of individual uniqueness that drives us to pursue our goals, we might think is a kind of myth. Life is full of change. We should be more comfortable with ambiguity and so on. Like, if we recognize this, what can we do about it? Especially when we learn how deeply entrenched these ideas are in our upbringing, in our education system, in our politics, in our art and music, in every area of our life. And at one point in the book, you mentioned your student who visited Samoa and experienced the communal culture there. And then when she returned, she said she felt lonely all the time and began to think of the individual self as a kind of burden. And I find my own students experience a similar sort of burden in American cultural norms about decision-making, which put all the pressure on the individual person to make their own choices. And then they hold the individual totally responsible for those choices. And there's little social support either in making decisions or in the aftermath of those decisions. So these students feel totally on their own and overwhelmed with this kind of burden of choice. In the last chapter of the book, which is about integrating these different self-conceptions, the book says these aspects of the self should be understood as a matter of general tendency and degree, not as presence or absence. And the competing self-tendencies can exist in a single individual, especially in cases of people who are bilingual or bicultural in terms of East Asian and Western heritage. But you also say the different self-tendencies can be developed by individuals. And I'm curious about that. So you give examples of successful integration that include academic subject knowledge, thinking procedures, political systems, art and music. I'm curious to hear more about how we might integrate the different systems and competing tendencies in our own personal lives. So if we think that our own culture's self-tendencies are limited, what can people brought up completely within one cultural worldview do to develop different self-tendencies? And I have a lot more I want to ask you about, but I'll end by just thanking you for writing such a vastly informative, interesting book.
Great. Thank you, team, for all this really wonderful comments. And I will actually give Professor Dr. Li a chance to respond to your comments. And so let's do that. And the floor is yours, Professor Li, if you have anything to say to respond to team.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. That's really humbling. I appreciate very much your comments. So you ask a very important question, and you're not alone. Many people who have read the book and ask the same question. Obviously, anybody growing in one culture, growing up in one culture, that person's concept of self is just one way, and the world is very large. And right now, through political, economic sort of development, where whether or not some country or some leadership likes it, it's a fact that we're more globalized, and people more than ever come into contact with each other. So very few people are truly left just within their own tribe or community or culture. Okay, so that's a fact. Like today's forum, I could not imagine 50 years ago we would have something like this. Okay, so that itself is saying that there's a strong need in the world's people to understand each other. And so, first of all, to avoid misunderstanding is very dangerous. It could lead to bloodshed, conflict of the world currently, right? We have at least 2 wars, 2 war fronts going on, if not more. So we have conflict all the time. But this is my effort. The fundamental motivation is to bridge cultural understanding. So we could, as team is very generous. Yeah, I have been teaching in the United States for like working here, studying, teaching almost 40 years. I have known so many people, young people, who are exactly what Tim was saying, pushed to seek their independence and make it on their own. But in fact, they need a lot of support. And I don't have to go into detail. I have family members because my husband is European American. They have family members that struggle like that. I also know on my Chinese side and on Chinese friend side, and they handle adolescents' challenge or rebellion differently. And the more support you give to the adolescent, the better the adolescent is going to fare in life. But the idea somehow somebody reaches 18 and you're on your own is today, even in my field, that's not how life unfolds. Okay, so I think the philosophy, in some sense, can hinder our children's development and education. On the other hand, if you go into extreme of this East Asian, dependency or interrelationality, especially if you apply that into domains that are, you should not. For example, bribery, corruption in China. In the book, I talk about that in the final chapter. And that's a problem. You should not be using personal relationships to influence political leaders to do favors for you. And that's even anywhere in the world. And people regard us as a unethical behavior. Again, it's very hard to draw boundaries. And I think each side needs to look at their own tradition carefully, recognize how children are brought up, how we function in life, and so on. I would think that in the West, through maybe perhaps community work and education, children should get more support and help. Should not be made to feel they have to do this on their own. And that's very damaging to their development. But on the other hand, some families, East Asian in particular, I mean, any other culture as well, like Latin American cultures also tend to be very family oriented. I have many students who told me that the parents, just say, hey, look, you need to come home to have this cookout. I said, but I have an exam to do. Well, come home anyway. You see, that's a problem. Okay, so they come to me and cry and say, oh, I don't know what to do. I said, well, maybe you can persuade your parents and to help you get through the academic work and do well, and family maybe another time, not all cookouts, anyway, things like that. So again, Tim, I want to add one more point. That is today, even in the United States, in Europe, their population is getting more diverse. So as people from different worlds live here, And maybe, people have to go to work together with someone who's not from your cultural background or ethnic background. You go to work, you meet all kinds of people, and then you learn to adapt. And chances are people not from the Western part, like Africa, Latin America, Arabic, these Asian countries, they tend to be more socially oriented, although not exactly the same as the Asians, as I talk about in this book, but nevertheless, very socially, family oriented, okay? And then maybe, in time that you can influence each other and then can learn to live with each other and then maybe change gradually. That I see that as a trend as well. Yeah, like young people become friends, right? Of different color, so they adapt to each other as well. So I think that's a wonderful, development. Anyway, I'll end my remarks there.
No, thank you very much for that answer. Yeah, I think that's like it may be indicative of the two different tendencies, because in my question, I was thinking, how would you develop them working on your own, right? If you wanted to cultivate, and you're saying, well, actually, it's not a matter of working on your own, right? But it's a matter of developing relationships with people who have the different.
Exactly. That's sustained life. All of us need that. All of us. It's really essential. And I think if Confucianism has anything to contribute, and Taoism as well, to this world, is that every person needs strong social relationships. And all research in the medical finds people who have strong social relationships live longer and healthier, and so on and so forth. Yes. So we, in different way, research comes back to support this idea that human relationality is absolutely essential to us.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And again, I deeply appreciated this book.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. That's a wonderful exchange. We need to move to the next discussant, Dr. Katherine Nong, who is a lecturer of Asian Chinese literature at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. Katherine trained and practiced as a medical doctor for several years in Sydney, Australia. Her current research interest is in the educational theories and practices of pre-modern and early modern Chinese didactic literature. She has co-authored a source book for traditional Chinese children's primers, which will be published in November 2025. Look forward to that. She's currently working on a translation of Collectanea of Ethical Accounts, also known in Chinese called 道德丛书. So thank you for being here, Katherine, and please share your comments or feedback or anything. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much to our chair, Yidi, and also very, very grateful to Paul for organizing all of this and for inviting me. But of course, thanks very much to Professor Li for this very wonderful book. I have to say that I really enjoyed reading it. Being a bicultural myself, having grown up in New Zealand and Australia, I felt that when I was reading this book, I was learning more about two halves of myself. and it was actually very enlightening to delve into these questions that I had but didn't really have answers in the past. So I enjoyed it very much on a personal level, but also it's very masterful on several levels. Not only are you crossing cultures, you're crossing disciplines, but I think more importantly, you're crossing a very important line between the theory and ultimately practice. So the idea of who am I, and then ultimately why I respond to others and the world around me and how I respond in the way that I do. So it's sort of, how I live in a way. So my comments very much relate to this kind of application, given my background, and when I think about back to my work in mental health and how some young people very much have this cultural identity crisis in a multicultural society like Australia, but also people coming into contact with other cultures will have these questions. And so I think that it will very much contribute to cross-cultural harmony and cross-cultural communication. So my first comment relates to the 7 facets of the self, which has really been drawn from 4 decades of cultural psychological studies, and you really creatively and usefully re-articulate this dichotomous self-schemas of the East and West in a very much more nuanced way. And because of the significance that you ascribe to each of these facets, I found myself, because as you heard, I don't really have a Western philosophical background, I found myself using a kind of clinical differential diagnostic model to bring these facets into sharper focus. And what I mean by that is oftentimes in the hospital, someone will come in with this chest pain. It's undifferentiated chest pain. They just say they have pain in their chest, but there are so many different causes of that. And in order to sort of find out the cause, you have to ask questions to distinguish. So it's called the differential diagnosis. And I think that that is so important in understanding each of these facets as well, because we could really use them in our life. So for example, when you talk about the let's say the essential self, you mentioned it as the belief, I quote, that there is something deeper, invisible inside each of us that distinguishes one individual from another. And so it got me thinking, so this essence, you could say, works at various levels, right? So this essence, could it be considered the fundamental entity or force underlying everything, this cosmos? Which in some traditions would be considered an idealistic order or ultimate reality, which all things are derived. But it's probably unlike your essential self that you talk about, because in the essential self, it's an individual and unique self, right? So then you would think about the next level of the essence, which is this essence dependent or derived from the fundamental entity? And to what extent does it then represent this fundamental entity or ultimate reality? Is it in part, or it's an entirety, sort of the one is all and the all is one kind of idea? If it is derived from the fundamental entity, or if it's not, if it's independent from the fundamental reality, but then in some way linked, perhaps through reason or rationality, that links us back to the divine, for example. So that's sort of one level, which I found myself thinking about your essential self, that perhaps it's either dependent or independent. And then the next level is, well, is this essence distinct from certain properties? Its properties, like its personality. And there's a very classic example in neurology textbooks, so I'm sure it's also found in psychology textbooks, of Phineas Gage, the railway worker, who, because of a work accident, had a very severe frontal lobe damage, had an iron rod sort of driven through his brain. And it caused such a dramatic sort of personality change. He was originally very responsible and respectful. And then after this frontal lobe damage, he was profane and capricious. So then the question was he the same person in terms of this essence? And if, in some views, if the answer is yes, then the essence is not tied to his personality. But then then it would seem that the essence is actually distinct from its properties. However, this view also then sometimes slides into another view that the essence is a certain core of character traits that might be relatively stable over time, which I noticed in your empirical studies section. You talked about the personality traits, for example, that people associate themselves with sort of stable personality traits, which then leads us to the next level, which is, okay, well, if the essence is related to its properties, which ones? Is it simply the properties that are morally good, like the belief in the morally good true self, or is it all of other properties? So I guess in many ways, in trying to get that level of focus in terms of which level really helped me think better about then, okay, which level is it that's then fixed or then malleable or bounded or flexible? So I think about when I think about your book, I think about how it might be used, perhaps in a more broader sense, and to create that sharper focus. And my second sort of comment relates to the psychological studies that form sort of the second part of each of your chapters, there was a very sustained discussion on filial piety or xiao as part of the role embodying self. And I want to build on this with sort of quite extensive sociological and psychological literature on filial obligations in Western cultures. And of course, it's not known as filial piety, it's more sometimes known as filial responsibility or intergenerational relations, because in some ways, this kind of literature perhaps challenges implicit assumptions that we might have on the Western self being quite characterized by independence and individualism, in the sense that these studies show us perhaps in Western societies that caregiving of elderly people also is associated with positive attitudes, psychological benefits as well. And in particular, before the dual filial piety model was developed in 2003, there were also other models such as familiarism and intergenerational solidarity. But what was quite interesting and special about the dual filial piety model was that it really brought reciprocal filial piety to the fore, in the sense that it's not just filial norms or obligations that motivate us towards intergenerational care, but more importantly, affection, empathy, this idea of reciprocity are also important motivations. And therefore, cultural psychologists in recent years have proposed filial piety as a contextualized personality construct, so in the context of the parent-child relationship. So in a way, you could say that this reciprocal filial piety really encompasses something that is voluntary. It's a care that's based on gratitude, which then stems from an individual autonomy. And I feel that perhaps these developments in this kind of research actually further corroborate your more nuanced interpretation of the multifaceted self, that it shows us that this part is not, it's not all just lumped together as a Western self, but actually there are so many different dimensions. So it actually perhaps helps to bring out that aspect that's very interesting and innovative part of your work. And in a similar vein, the renewed interest in humility in Western discourse, not just in sort of philosophy and psychology, but also in leadership and politics in recent decades, is very much also worthy of discussion when we consider the Western promotional self. And by reading your 2016 article, which also was, very, very comprehensive in providing us with a state of the art in terms of what was happening at the time. But I feel that at some points that it's also important to bring this into the discussion of integration, because notably the Western literature on humility has really developed without impetus from, if not limited reference to, East Asian conceptions of humility. The so-called sixth personality factor that you mentioned in the Hexaco model resulted, as you would know, from studies across 7 languages, with the only Asian language being Korean. So contemporary scholars have really reconceptualized humanity in terms of perhaps more accurate self-assessment, as opposed to low self-regard or self-denigration, which was what was associated with these negative connotations in the past, which means that perhaps it doesn't necessarily run counter to being individualistic, taking the initiative, seizing opportunities, taking risks, as per the promotional self. And I think that this kind of research really raises interesting questions on how we might then approach the integration of the effacing self with the promotional self, given that this seems to be occurring from within the Western discourse itself. I think that I would be interested in your thoughts on that issue of how these can come together, given that the Western literature on humility is fast developing, and thinking about how this could be integrated. Given the time, I'm going to end with 2 questions. And the first question is about when I was reading your book, I felt that there was perhaps a critique of the Western self, but perhaps also a criticism of some of those elements that you just mentioned about individuality, and was that your intention? The second question I have is that that sometimes when reading the East Asian self, there's a sense that it's idealized or ideal state, perhaps of cultivation, and particularly with being interrelational. But at the same time, I think about the Confucian context where you might have the Junzi, the exemplary person, versus the xiaoren, the petty person. And when I think about the petty person, I think about someone who might be more bounded or fixed in their ways, in their sort of desires and opinions. And I wanted to know your thoughts on that. But given the time, I'll end there now. And certainly thank you so much for this opportunity to learn from you as well as everyone else here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your feedback and also questions. So I will give you a chance to Professor Li to respond to you. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, Katherine, thank you so much for your very complex comments and these questions. And I want to say I'm like struck so much that you studied medical science, then you move into clinical and educational work. That's incredible. I just cannot imagine doing that. So you raised your comments are really interesting. Like on the essential self, you pointed out many other nuances that could be further explored. And I agree. This idea, because I wrote this book from the Western, sort of reading Western philosophy. They, of course, didn't go into details of things like damaged brain, although some people experimented that. Like even John Locke said, what happens if somebody's finger is cut and that finger continues to live? Does the finger person is the same person as the person who has the original brain? They experimented those philosophical ideas. It's incredible. So yes, but today you're right. For example, you commented on somebody who has a brain damage and the personality may be changed, right? So that's changeable. I agree. It just from the psychological research from Strominger and their work at Yale more recently, they have experimented all kinds of what if the brain is cut and then transplanted onto somebody's body? Who is the same person? The person with the brain, or person who just has the body, or many other ways like taking pharmaceutical and then your personality changes, and then you used to like X, now you don't, and you like Y, but at least from the viewer, from the people who heard these look at these changed people. And their research says, no, you can do superficial changes and people still think it's the same person, so long as that person's moral stays the same. So if a good man now turned into a child molester, most Americans would think that's no longer the same person. So the moral is really powerful in people's minds. And so just, and brain damage, and that's, of course, it's a clinical situation. So I don't know if people will think, oh, you changed into a completely different person, because if the evidence shows that the person can't function as before, then I think that there should be the idea that the person's maybe changed fundamentally. So the stable, you talk about how stable it is. Is it the actual fundamental entity, or is it is it the idea of independence? As in the book, I also try to distinguish these two. Is it, essential self the same as the bounded self? And conceptually, I was trying to argue that the idea being something essential in yourself may not be exactly the sense you have to draw a boundary in terms of how you relate to others. So from the research, psychological research, Western people tend to draw a tighter boundary. Because I am married, my husband has married, but I was married to a European American man. And I just have the first-hand experience. And that personal boundary is very important, no matter the relationship. So I have that pretty visceral experience as well. And some of my writing or motivation comes from long, decades of living with somebody who's really quite different to start with. So yeah, I agree. You mentioned these things, so we should really look at this, and it's wonderful. And filial piety, yeah, it's a huge topic, and people continue to explore that. So basically, what I did in this book, Katherine, you're right, is to look at philosophy and basically by design. This is what these philosophers were thinking and proposing, that we, ordinary people, live this life. And this is how we relate to take care of our aging parents. And contemporary research across the world, among East Asian diaspora, and does show that the East Asians tend to particularly take, care, probably out of their obligation, but mostly, I also read research is based on their emotional, empathetical, emotional bonding with their parents, particularly if they have that kind of bonding. They tend to be much more motivated to take good care of their parents. So you're absolutely correct. This is a foundational. The question is how do we foster that in everyone, regardless of culture, because aging generation needs support. It's not a matter of medicine. It's a matter of care and love from the family. And it's a huge problem in the world. I'm sure people study that field would strongly argue that we need to do something serious to change the landscape. Okay, so from the, say, philosophical design, Confucianism, the idea is for the children to, early on to be taught that, hey, you're very lucky to have parents who love you and care for you. Therefore, you shall reciprocate that as you grow older, become a benefactor to your parents, because they will be losing their capacity. So that teaching, ideally, I'm not saying, goes well for every family. No. And that's why China, for like 20 years ago, passed law, right? Passed law that you have to, the filial support, the financial support, the psychological support is written into Chinese law. And I also know to various degrees in Korea and in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and Singapore as well. They have laws that strongly promote filial piety. So although not exactly the same as the Chinese law, okay? Chinese law basically said a grown adult person must provide financial and psychological support to your elderly who no longer are able to take care of themselves. It's a law, okay? So yeah, your workplace will deduct your pay and pay for your parental support. So anyway, so that I agree, it's a huge topic, and that needs to be studied very well, and also new designs proposed to foster community, foster family care. And your question, you said that in the book, maybe I have voiced a certain way that may make people feel like I'm critical of Western independent self. If that comes across as that, then I regret. I actually try very hard to be neutral, to describe what it is from philosophy and from psychological research. But if you ask me, as I said earlier in response to Tim's question, I do personally feel that if a child grows up not able to develop strong relationships, and not able to reciprocate the social responsibility to each other, then that's unfortunate. I don't think any individual person can fare very well in this world without strong social support, family, friends, and other people, like teachers and so on. So I think it's very important. It's true, indeed. I do not think that the individualistic way is going to sustain humanity. In some situations, you need to make your own decisions, so on and so forth. But overall, we do need support to get through life. So that's just my response. East Asian model self may be idealized. Just one word to clarify. When you look at the philosophical writing, Confucius, Mencius, and many others, okay, true, they are, of course, expressing the ideal world. And I'm also aware of Western. If you read Plato, it's also an ideal world that they portray. So therefore, I would call that by design. So by design, they hope or they propose a human life ought to be lived that way. We ought to pursue this kind of life, and this is the reason. And they give very clear reasons. So I think in that sense, both worlds are idealized. That's because as I took ideas from philosophy. But from psychology, it's not 100% in any study. It's a tendency. So statistically, as you know, you study medicine, if we reach certain statistical level, we would say we have this confidence that this group tends to think this way more than the other way. So it's a tendency. Yeah, so I regret I didn't mean to idealize, but I probably represented. I took ideas that come across as idealizing, but the world is far from being ideal, for sure, in any family, in any individual self. I wish I had written a little bit more about it. I really appreciate that you pointed out that tendency. Yeah, finally, humility. Yes, I think it's huge, and Asian humility has been sort of ignored for a long time. So not just me. There a very wonderful Doyle Kim from Korea. He has written extensively on Confucian humility as an extremely important way to conceptualize one part of yourself, how you live, how you respond to the world, but it's not weakness. It's human strength. And I also took from his ideas as well. But thank you. There's so much more to think about. And Katherine, thank you so much for your very wonderful remarks and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Li. I have to say that that's one of the really lovely things about your book is that it's got the ideal and the real world as well in there, and the practice and the theory. So I really learned a lot from it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you both. That's wonderful. Then let's go to our last but not least discussant, Dr. Luyao. She is a postdoctoral researcher fellow at Peking University, Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. She earned her PhD from Nanyang Technological University Department of Philosophy. Her research interests include Taoism, Neo-Taoism, comparative philosophy, with a special focus on harmony and freedom in the Zhuangzi. She has published papers on responsive harmony in Zhuangzi and harmonizing virtuosities in the Zhuangzi. Let's welcome Dr. Luyao to give her comments. Yeah, Luyao, can you unmute yourself? And yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, my internet is unstable. Thank you, Professor Li, for a very inspiring book, and I really learned a lot from it, especially how to, considering yourself from many different perspectives and how it would influence our social practice. I have mainly 4 questions and sincerely hope to discuss with you. And my first concern is about the concept self, particularly its complexity in both East Asian and Western contexts. You have also mentioned in the book there are many related concepts, such as individual, agent, human in the West, and 无己我身, and so on in the East Asian tradition. My question is there is there a special reason that you prefer to choose the concept self rather than others, such as individual or agent or so on? Because the self to me it seems more about the reflection of oneself of
We didn't hear you.
materials.
Sound. Sound.
Course,
Mm.
as you mentioned, the 无己,我, and so on, like which concepts are included in could be included in the discussion, and there are a line that we draw that which concepts or which aspects of those concepts we take into consideration and others are not. Yeah, my second question concerns about the chapter that making the distinction between the Western. In this section, you discuss it. When we considering the human nature, the 性, I wondering whether it represents an essential self as well, rather than a particular one. Because Confucius has said the 性相近. Moreover, on whether human nature is good or bad, both agree. Both of them agree human nature are all good or all bad. So yeah, human nature are also similar in their thoughts. And as you also mentioned that in the Neo-Confucianism, there is an important idea of 礼仪分数, one pattern, and its many particularizations. It's also it suggests that it's not only emphasize the particularity, but also suggests that there is an underlying patterns of self that may related to the essential self rather than a particular self. Yeah, that may also any other schools, for example, in Moism, the tone or the sameness is an essential principle in governing a state. So that seems to require some something that are not that particular. Yeah, that's my second question. My third concern is the I guess it's the last chapter in your book about the promotional self and efficient self. In discussing the promotional self in the West, you mentioned the self-promoting power of human agency, whereas the efficient self in East Asian thought is associated with humility. If we compare these two, the former emphasizes the initiating action, while the later highlights the responsiveness. I totally agree that Confucianism would advocate humility and responsiveness to the heaven and earth. But it seems that human agency also plays an important role in Confucianism. Because, for example, that Confucianism would say that the heaven, earth, and humanity, which was called 天地人, would be 三才, and also the sage kings in Confucianism will have to initiate some ritual system that help to organize the whole society. So I guess that is the not so effacing part. And the last part, and my last question is about the chapters you mentioned about the bounded self and bounded self, flexible self, and fixed self, and malleable self. These two chapters, you make a very clear distinction and very inspiring that these two groups of concepts are different from each other. And my question here is about a scholar in Chinese philosophy, which is Guo Xiang. Maybe he is not that follows the category. He's even maybe we could translate it as a limitation of human nature. Seems to focus on the bounded self oh sorry seems more focused on the fixed self, and the 性分like the draw limitation of everyone's human nature seems more related to a bounded self. I'm not trying to say that because of his example would make but sorry, I just hope to discussing with you whether there are something like this example that are not follows the gender categories of the distinctions. I mean, in this different aspect in the chapters. Yeah, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luyao, for all your questions. So Professor Li, now it's your time to respond, to answer them.
Yeah, always wonderful. You know, it's the thing that people say that you don't you know, you try to read something not in the field you're trained in, and then you venture out and study something that's you know, difficult, and that like philosophy is something that it was not my training. So here we go. We meet somebody who is far more versed in Chinese philosophy, and then really expensive, and you know, understanding the whole landscape. Yeah, I appreciate your remarks very much and your questions. The first one, yeah, I did mention in the book that the Chinese concept of self is really ancient time. We had those, and then very different. So I actually had trouble understanding exactly Wu, Shen, Yu, and Yu, you know, throughout Chinese the text in history. And it's very hard, but Professor Cai Danjun from Renmin Daxue, she made a post and actually relied on her expertise on why certain words of self are used in what way and so on. So I thought her just because she's an expert in that, in Chinese ancient literature and so on. So the reason I chose to use the self is very simple, is completely practical, because psychology, East Asian psychology, or psychology who study East Asian concept of self, written in English, has been using the term 自我, especially scholars in Taiwan in their indigenous psychology, and that's the term they use. And also some philosophers like Chen Zhongyi, I believe, in Hawaii University, he was the one who actually early on wrote a very influential paper on 自己, where that came from. So that's why I relied, you know, I thought about it, which words, and 自我is also right now in contemporary Chinese. Again, it's a mixture of ancient words and plus sort of current 白话 influence, and 自我 is not an original Chinese term, 自我做. However, 我 or 自, 身, whatever, okay. But now it's the common term. So it's a very practical choice. It's not a philosophical choice. But I looked at ancient, you know, words used. So just establish that we have that concept. Okay. So that's the first answer. So the Xin, Yeah, you're right. It's a very serious philosophical theory and originating, well, you can say Confucius, because in Alice we only use the 性相近,习相远, 性 used once, okay. And then it was the Confucius that took up this idea, introduced the 心性 theory, and later on picked up, of course, by Neo-Confucians, very elaborate on what that is and so on. So your question is this not an essential self? Well, in the book, I think I did try, though, to entertain that question. Is it essential? No, the Xing, of course, ancient Chinese philosophers definitely acknowledged that there's something in each one of us, okay? And that's our nature. So they use the term Xing. And of course, interestingly, the word Xing is made of Shen, okay? And the Xing, heart and the Shen, that becomes our Xing. So I think Roger Ames and Tang Junyi, people like that, used, talk about this a lot. And basically they're saying is that this is the beginning. So in terms of particularity is, yes, I didn't use the term essential, but it's something in each of us that's a dispositional. We're born with a distinct way, like I talked about that in current developmental psychology. Look at infants, you give different infants the bitter taste, you will have completely different reactions. And that's not learned. Day one, you can do this experiment. Different infants will show different reactions. Some would lash out, loud cry, some just frown a little bit. And that is, I'm sure Confucians observe that as well. As a little baby, different, okay? So I'm not surprised they proposed the idea of Xing. Yeah, the particularity lies in the fact of what happens to that Xing. So it's the development from that point on, that's particular, because you raise the particular parents and you face particular social context situations, and you do two things. Either you receive the guidance or you purposely adapt yourself or change yourself. And that is particular to each individual. So in this book, I try to argue that way. Yes, good and bad nature is 离分书. Yes, again, it's not just me. And the Zhuxi faced the question from his students a lot. Are you talking about the one thing? That's the, thing from Taoist to the Tao as a Li pattern, or multiple. And Zhuxi basically gave a very dialectical answer. Well, we can talk about the one thing together if we talk about abstract. But if we look at different levels, different individuals, we talk about many, many, many small patterns. Okay, so that's the even, which is a very good answer to that question. So again, you're right. They did acknowledge that the world just didn't exist, or is not composed of multiple things, just a lump of things. But there is an organizing principle. That's the higher structure called the Tianli, right? It came from a Taoist, particularly Taoist argument. There's the Tao, okay? And then differentiates into through qi, through energy and vital stuff, and then gave forms that we sense, we experience. Anyway, it's a very complicated philosophy. Again, the particularity and for Neo-Confucianism is to each person to answer your own question, to pursue self-cultivation in daily life. And that is very particular. How do you deal with your parents? How do you deal with a wife? How do you deal with the friends? How do you deal with the king you work for leader? And how do you deal with the children? And a very outside family, neighbors, very concrete. And that's where they argue. We need to pay our attention, where we need to so-called walk the way. Okay, and then later Wang Yaoming, okay, the 知行合一, particularly very, very specific. So. And the next question was about effacing promotion. I think the effacing self is basically humility. I said in the book that I prefer to use humility humble, but the psychological field used self-effacement and modesty extensively. In fact, very few people ever use humility. I think Katherine was right. It's a complete ignore. So I try to, but because I have to cite research, I just don't want to use completely different words. So I continue to use a self-effacement. You're right. In English, self-effacement is more negative a concept about the person because their cultural model is the promotion to be active, to take initiative, to take risk, and to show your strength, your assertiveness, and so on. And in the book, I was trying to say that you're right, absolutely. In the article that Katherine mentioned, 2016 is Asian humility. I talk about the tremendous agency. It is not weakness. It's a different way. We first of all have to acknowledge our limitation, but doesn't mean we're sitting there and we're so fearful. No, we take initiative in a different way, in a way that's like appropriate. Again, don't forget the ritual propriety. Li has to be 合理, okay? So it can't be just your own way and push through. Our current political situation in the United States, you can see that, okay? It's a kind of very difficult. Anyway, so you're right, but I agree with you. Arguing somehow self-effacement has no agency is wrong. Guo Shang, unfortunately, I didn't study him, and I look forward to your teaching, enlightening me on that. So in those two chapters, one on flexible self and the other one on fixed self versus bounded self, flexible self, and fixed self versus valuable self, they used up mixed together, but actually if you look at literature, they actually refer to different things. So I try to distinguish and bring out, like Tim was saying, these different facets can be lumped together. And of course, this book is the invitation to people like you and the join to continue to explore. And perhaps even like Katherine was saying, propose, or Tim saying, propose ways we can change, we can make the world better or understand each other better. Thank you very much for this remarkable, wonderful comments from all of you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Prof.
Yes, thank you all. I think we still have about 25 minutes left, so I think it's time to open the floor to our audience, our public. I wonder if any of you have questions, you can use the raise hand features so I can see who is going to ask questions, and I will try to moderate, try to keep people in queue or line to answer their questions. Or if there are any further comments or conversation our panelists and our speaker want to discuss, definitely we can also do that. So I would just open the floor. If any of you want to ask questions, the online audience or the panelists.
Please feel free. I would very appreciate the audience questions.
Maybe I can try to use my privilege as a chair to ask my questions, Professor Li. While I was looking at your interdisciplinary research, I'm very intrigued by this, intersection between psychology and philosophy. But my kind of immediate response is that when I look at myself, I was thinking whether the psychological self is really identical with or is the same thing as a philosophical self, because I can feel when I was trying to reflect upon my psychological self, it seems I'm a very pretty sensitive person. I have so many emotions that I need to process every day. But when I shift to a more philosophical self, it seems that I more rely upon or appeal to my, let's say, reason, rationality. So just within myself, I can see a kind of a split between a philosophical self and a psychological self. So I just wonder, when you are talking about self, referring to self, do you see there's a tension between these two aspects, or whether there needs to be a reconciliation between these two aspects? I'm just curious.
Very interesting. Well, thank you, Yidi. You ask a very important question that is within the individual's life. And this is mostly the domain of psychological research of the past 100 years. So of course we know a person lives through each day. We're not talking about children growing up. We're talking about adults, right? Adults living, an adult lives through the day. Of course, we encounter situations and we do our tasks, so we do things. So there, yeah, we definitely have these multifaceted so-called intelligence. Okay, and Howard Gardner talked about these 7 different intelligences. So we talk about each human, of course, has cognition, and that's just a given. Everybody has that capacity, and the child born has that capacity and develops. So when you are doing your work, thinking, sit down, calm down, thinking about your studies, you are engaged in intellectual activity. And chances are you're not terribly stirred up unless you read something that's very, very disturbing. And we have that too. For example, if you read history, you will read World War II history, you read, the Nazis who did the killing, but also East Asian situations and Japanese invasion and Nanking massacre. Of course, you sit there, even though you're doing scholarship, but you can't help but react very emotionally, very strongly, because your moral sense is triggered and moral emotions. So again, within the individual life, you go through the day and your feelings, your cognitive thinking, your emotion, your social, and your friends come and you're very happy, you interact with them. And if you have family, you deal with your family, your child, and your spouse. It's very common for all individuals. Of course, we encounter problems and we get distressed. So that's a different kind of daily functioning. So then, say the book, in the book I wrote. The book I wrote is basically saying, okay, taking the human lives as a whole, how should we together, each individual, but collectively together, okay, live our lives? How should we go through this life? And then how does our life unfold as a general sort of a process instead of individualized daily life function? Although psychologists study that, Yidi, you're correct. Lots of psychologists just study daily functioning. They take data, have people wear things on their wrist and then pulse taking the body temperature. Oh, yes, there's plenty of that research, wonderful research. When do we feel happy? When do we feel distressed? And when we feel happy, what do we do? When we feel distressed, what do we do? Yeah, plenty of research dealing with that level. I would, recommend you may check some of them. Also brain function as well. But as a whole, in terms of philosophical conceptualization, if you look at Tao Te Ching, it doesn't talk about individual life, period. It talks about how we as together face Tao. Well, are we part of Tao? Yes, we are part of Tao, right? Then how do we understand Tao? When we start to understand Tao, then our understanding is limited. 道可道，非常道. Immediately telling you, okay, that which can be talked about is no longer the same Tao. We depart the undifferentiated. The undifferentiated can never be fully understood by us. And so it's that kind of understanding of, humans are limited. I take from Lao Tzu's writing as humans are limited. Thinking somehow we could dominate or control Tao is very foolish. Okay, so I think Lao Tzu would say it's very foolish. We need to be humble, but what we can do is get close to Tao, is to sense it. Okay, so we can sense it, and then we can calm down. So taking this to Yidi example, okay, you feel distress or you feel emotion. Then if you take a Taoist perspective on your life, you go like, you know what, I need to calm down. Life doesn't go well. I have this problem with this person, that person, and so on. You know what? I'm going to 退一步海阔天空. I'm going to step back. I'm going to drop some burdens. I'm going to relax. I'm going to take a cup of tea. I am going to, that's the type of kind of a writing I try to do in this book. If you have that Taoist philosophy, Tao is the way to help your life. Your life is shaped differently than say, I need to charge. I need to promote myself. I need to be the Robinson Crusoe. I need to, overcome this island. I need to, so, that's a different response to the world, you as an individual. Anyway, sorry, I just stopped it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for answering my question. Yeah, appreciate it. Any other question from our audience or from our panelists? Yeah, team.
Yeah, if no one else has a question, I can ask a question I'm not very sure about, but I guess in reading through the 14, total aspects of the Western and East Asian self that you address in the book, the one that I least recognized was the Western impersonal self.
Mm.
And I think you're right that is a requirement of professional life and of political office holders and of judges and things like that. But in daily life, I'm not so sure about that one, right? I think at least in American culture, right, it's very informal, right? Like that all the impersonal aspect of the self might also conflict with the idea that we are just supposed to be ourselves, across all situations, and that you are encouraged to talk about yourself, right? In many different situations and things like that. So I guess I was curious. I'm not very confident in this question, but I am curious to hear more about that dimension, the Western impersonal self, just because all the others I felt I readily recognized, right? But that one, so like for instance, when we teach philosophy, like ethical philosophy, like Kant, right, who I think is the best example of impersonal reason, the students find it very hard to understand, like what that sort of reason is all about, right? Like
Thank you, Tim. And your question makes me think maybe I should try harder to, to articulate what that distinction is. So that, to begin with, is based on my experience living in the United States for 40 years. Prior to that, I studied German. So I interacted with quite a few German teachers and so on. Okay. So as an Asian person, as a Chinese person growing up in China, when you meet people, I think the first thing we all can recall, the first time you met a Western person, there is a strong warmth, emotional expression. I agree that comes from, because it's well documented that Asians tend to be calmer in their emotional arousal versus European heritage people tend, especially Americans, we promote happiness, excitement, and positive outlook. There's no doubt. Research documents that very well. So the impersonal part is actually not the emotional expression part, okay? Rather, when you interact in the West with people, you have to be put on high alert that you don't overstep that person's individual boundary. So Tim, for example, you're friendly, casual, but somebody stepped over the boundary, like butt in your life business, you would be very highly alert. Whereas it's Asians, we're a little bit easy. You know what I mean? Is that, oh yeah, oh, maybe we can have dinner. Like for example, in China, whenever I go back, visit China, I would have strangers come up and say, lady, can I help you carry your luggage? Now, I ask the person may not be a bad person because the person sees me hauling luggage, just comes to help me. And I said no. And the person will not take a no for an answer. Now, here in America, I think the luggage holder would go like, please, get off. Okay, that's impersonalization. Whereas I could not do that because this man was nice. Multiple times he said, well, I see you carrying this. Let me just help you. But the Korean colleague told me he was at a grocery store staying in line, trying to get something. A lady, older lady, comes in and put a bunch of like potatoes in his hand. They said, these are free. The grocery store offers it free. You may not know. And they're strangers. And this Professor Kim, said, oh, thank you very much. Now, here, imagine somebody dumped something in your lap when you were in a grocery store. You would feel like, wait a minute, what are you doing? Okay, you could tell, oh, is it free? Oh, would you like to get some? You have to at least ask. There, this lady just did it. Okay, and the recipient is quite happy accepting that. So I'm talking about that level. Kind of, you have to be put on high alert if somebody is invading your personal space. Is Asia, we're a little bit easy with that. And I give you example this the market. My sister Tang, you read that part, right? You go in, you immediately address strangers as your family members. Oh, 大爷大娘, 大哥大嫂. You immediately use family terms, address terms to socialize. Very soon, next time you see them, oh, Wang, you name the name. It's, oh, where do you live? And become friends very quickly. So again, that's a typical example of East Asians coming, with each other and building relationships. That's what I'm talking about. Here, you're alert on the boundary, the personal boundary. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I think these points are well taken. Yeah, I would just say, there are regional differences in the U.S. too, and maybe like, for instance, the Northeast is more impersonal, like in comparison with the American South or the American Midwest where I am from, and I think the West Coast is maybe something else entirely, right? Yeah, but thank you for that answer. Yeah, it helps me understand it much better.
Yeah, very nice. Any other questions? We still have some time. I'd like to hear from the audience.
Yes, I think we have one question from the audience. Wendy, can you unmute yourself? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for thank you for this interesting talk. And it seems that the self Professor Li mentions today is a socialized version of self. It seems it's constituted by the modes we acquire, by the patterns we internalize through like the norms, the like cultures, the Western, the Eastern different culture, the Western like pursuing for individuality, and the Eastern pursuit of interrelational like harmony. Giving me an impression that this self is just the modes of our behavior, of our how we do things, how we perceive things, and how we react to the environment. Like we are formed by those modes we acquire. Like the psychological modes, and we know that certain behavioral modes can also interfere with our bodily routine. And when I have this idea that maybe the self, the identity is acquired like externally, and there are some professors, they say that no, you still have your genes, you have this bodily foundation, you have desires, hormones. And I'd like to ask Professor Li how this bodily based self, like this totally spontaneous, like the body directed self, how this self interact with this socially internalized or socially acquired self, how they interact with each other. And I really look forward to hearing some cases and the viewpoints from the psychological viewpoint. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much for posing
Yeah.
this very interesting question.
Okay.
Yes, there's no doubt from modern science, and I think Professor here, Katherine can tell you from medical research as well. Okay, so
Okay.
each one of us is born with our genetics, no doubt. Okay, but there's also something called you're talking body, and basically you're talking the biological existence. Every human, of course, has that. Otherwise, you wouldn't have your life. Okay, so there's it goes without saying. It's a typical. In our field, we have this ongoing fundamental questions called the nature nurture. So how does a person develop? Is it because of by biology alone, or is it interaction between biology and nurture? Nurture means the environment, your parents, the social, whatever, provide support and help and love and so on, and food as well, okay, to raise you. So we know from comprehensive research and also long-term research, a human, any one of us, develops as a result of interaction between our biology and our social world. And no human can ever grow only on one side, because the minute you're born, the interaction begins. Even before you're born, when the mother is pregnant with you, and she had to take nutrition and the kind of care she receives, the kind of a person she was, like distressed or not, and calm and so on. All of that has to do, of course, with life outside her body, right? So all of that influences fetal development. So even from the very beginning, the social is always an integral part of each human. So there's no way you could ever separate even the brain. Our current brain is not the original brain. Any current brain is a result of your nature-nurture interaction. So in this book, for example, I gave research conducted by a bunch of Beijing University professors as on a representation of a brain part that's responsible for processing our self-referential information. Is it me or not me? Okay. Turned out that both Western people and Chinese people's brain, the same part of the brain process the same self-referential information. But the Western people's brain is only that part reserved to processing their own self-information. The Chinese brain also uses that part to process the close people, like my mother, my best friend. It's the same part that lights up. So you can ask, is it the same biological brain, or is it a brain already socialized, interacted with the environment, your culture? So again, our culture is very profound, influencing who we are. We use the term shaping you, channeling you, but not completely determine you, but shape you, like guiding you into this road. Okay, then everything else, you have your agency, you have your own thinking, you have to adjust to it, make decision. And things can go wrong if there's too much control, like in the prison time, right? Prisoners are completely controlled by the environment, and that's terrible life. Nobody wants that life. So it's a balance. You have to have freedom to act, but the cultural influence is very osmosis. Frequently, we're not aware that we're being shaped by our culture. So when you become aware, usually it's too late. Okay, or you step outside your culture, study something, you look back, oh, this is how I came to be. This is how my parents raised me. Without that perspective, you just take for granted. This is how things go. So I hope I gave you the example of, the social. The social is not necessarily, just purposefully to damage you, but the social proceeds as naturally as human lives unfold. Yeah, because everybody is situated in a particular culture, in a particular context.
Okay,
hope I
thank you
answered
for
that
your
question.
answer. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very enlightening, and I'd like to ask the information that you just mentioned about the brain part, the Western Eastern differences of processing the information. Is it a paper, or can you
It's in my
tell
book.
me?
It's in my book. Take the book.
Oh, it's
Yes.
in your book. Oh, I
Yeah,
will read
it's
the
in my,
book. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
it's in my
Thank
book,
you. Thank you.
definitely. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I will read the book.
Mhm,
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What you just said just like makes me feel our brain seems to be this like recipient of like data, and our actually ourself it's you have like kind of biological like foundational basis, but later on you have to face this like culturally informed self. So these two things actually like go hand in hand or in tandem. But I wonder if it's possible for myself to choose what kind of self I want to be, rather than like I'm just like a kind of passive recipient of all those like datas and information.
Very good question. Really wonderful, fabulous, fabulous. Yes, in this book, particularly in the final chapter about integration, about things that can be integrated to things that may have challenge, I talk about the research. There's a lot of research on bilingual, bicultural people. So within the culture, it's because you're not even aware of these shaping forces. And of course, you can choose your career, you can choose your study, whatever interest you are, philosophy and chemistry, whatever. And that's common in any culture. But choosing the self, okay. So when you step outside China, come to the United States, from that moment on, research shows that you're developing a second frame, self frame. So as a result of this bicultural or tricultural, whatever, okay, if your parents are from two different cultures speaking two different languages, and then you start day one having that same two things. But when you come to a different culture, you develop a different frame. And that's how immigrant people deal with the challenges. It's also not a choice. You have to, because you live here. And then your previously sort of ongoing original self and your new self interact, negotiate. You find ways. Eventually, what happens to people, this research shows that when you are interacting with Chinese people, going back home, the Chinese self is going to be activated. Okay, whereas switch back to interacting with European heritage or African American and Latin American, different people, then you have a different frame. We could have multiple frames that we can call upon to help us to interact appropriately. Yeah, it's our individual human body, human self, it's very powerful, very agentic. We can develop multiple selves, but at any moment, we may not use multiple because that can contradict. If you deal with somebody who's very tight in the boundary, and this person, I better leave that person alone. I better not invade that person's individual space. Whereas you switch to the Asian, your buddy, your friends, you of course you petition, hey, drink more, hey, have more, this and that candy, and then you cannot do this to a colleague. So that's a typical example. You switch around with these frames. Yeah, I think that's probably the way we move forward in this multi sort of a globalize the world, interacting with people. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Li. With that note, I think we are right at the end of our event, and it's already like 10:01. So I want to thank Paul for, organizing this wonderful event. I've learned a lot from you guys, and also all the panelists. I really appreciate your presence and your comments. And yeah, Paul, do you want to have the last word before we end the whole event?
Oh, no, I think this is one of the events I have enjoyed the most. So thank you guys so
Very
much.
nice and kind. Yes.
Yeah. I really, really enjoyed it. This is a great
Thank
activity.
you. This is fabulous for me. I just like all the discussions. You just offer so much insight And I just like, unfortunately, I couldn't, answer all of your questions fully, but they make me think more. They make me think. So I'm going to check 播相. Make sure I don't miss some important. I have to confess, 墨子. I'm a little wary about Mozi's writing because I love mentions. So it's very hard for me to accept the Mozi's 兼爱 or 非攻. I like his 非攻, but I also just reading 吕氏春秋. It's a very strong argument that why a country must have military. And military is not always evil and it's necessary to defend. But anyway, there's a lot of Chinese philosophy. There's lots of ideas for us to think about. And Mozi is a little bit uneasy for me. But anyway, I'm going to read Mozi. Anyway, I'm forced myself to read Mozi. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for your great insights. I really, I look forward to continue our discussions and interacting with you. Yes, very much.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Professor.
everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.